The silence between stars. The signal came from the edge of the galaxy, and it was the sound of nothing. That was the terrifying part. Not an explosion, not a cry for help, not even a final broken transmission from some dying colony. Just silence. A deep, total, absolute silence that spread from star system to star system like a slow disease. One day, a world would be broadcasting its usual chatter of trade signals and navigation beacons. The next day, nothing. As if someone had simply turned off a switch. The Galactic Conclave received the first confirmed report on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything to most of the 31 species sitting in its great circular chamber, but it meant something to Delegate Yara Osei, who had grown up in Accra and still counted her days the old Earth way. She was sitting in her assigned seat, third row from the back, reviewing trade proposals from the Vithani Commerce Guild, when the emergency lights came on. Red, slow pulse. That meant something big. She sat up straight and looked toward the center of the chamber, where the Grand Speaker, a tall, four-armed Drelhari named Councillor Vath, was already standing at the podium with the particular stillness that very old, very scared beings sometimes had. 14 systems, Vath said. His translator rendered his words in flat, even tones, but everyone in the room could see the faint tremor in his upper arms. 14 systems have gone dark in the past 30 days. The pattern is consistent. The spread is accelerating. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet at all. Delegates were on their feet. Translators struggled to keep up with the overlapping voices. The Keth Dominion's 3 representatives, large slate-gray beings with faces that rarely showed emotion, were speaking rapidly into a private channel. The Vithani, small and quick and feathered, were clustering together the way they always did when they were frightened. The Solari Compact, who controlled the largest military fleet in the conclave, had their lead delegate requesting an immediate, closed session. Yara watched all of it from her seat, and did not stand. She simply listened. Over the next 6 hours, the picture became clearer, and it was not a good picture. The thing spreading through the outer rim had been named the Devouring Tide by the first survey team that had studied it. A team that had not come back, incidentally, which told you something. It was not a natural phenomenon. It moved with purpose, with direction, following certain kinds of signals, certain electromagnetic frequencies. It targeted populated worlds. And whatever it was made of, drones, organisms, something in between, it left absolutely nothing behind. No rubble, no bodies, no signals, just empty space where something used to be. The Conclave's military advisors presented their projections. The numbers were not good. At current speed, the tide would reach the inner populated systems within 8 to 12 years. If it accelerated, as it had twice already, that number dropped to 4. Then came the part that made Yara set down her water glass and stare. One by one, the great powers of the conclave began to speak about what they planned to do. And one by one, they said the same thing in different ways. The Solari Compact, with its enormous fleet, announced it was pulling all vessels back to its home cluster to form a defensive perimeter. The Keth Dominion said it would seal its borders and focus on protecting its own core worlds. The Vithani, the Drelhari, the Moor Confederation, all of them, different words, the same message. They were going to wait, they were going to hide, they were going to protect themselves and leave the outer colonies, billions of living beings, to the silence. Yara requested the floor. Councillor Vath gave it to her, probably because he expected her to announce that Earth would be doing the same thing. How many people live in the outer rim systems that are currently projected to fall within the tide's path? She asked. A data specialist pulled up the numbers. 44 billion, give or take. And we're discussing defensive perimeters, she said. Not as an accusation, just as a statement of fact, delivered clearly. The Solari Compact's lead delegate, a heavy-set being named Praetor Hound, who had always treated Earth's seat in the conclave the way someone treats a child's drawing hung on an important wall, turned to look at her. Delegate Osei, the mathematics are not in favor of engagement. Any fleet that advances toward the tide will be destroyed. We have run the projections 17 times. What were the casualty estimates for an engagement? Yara asked. Approximately 90% fleet loss minimum before any meaningful damage can be inflicted on the tide's core structure, Hound said. Which is why no fleet will advance. Yara nodded slowly. I understand, she said. She sat down. That evening she sent a single transmission to Earth. It was short. It explained the situation in plain language. It ended with the words, "They are abandoning 44 billion people. What are your orders?" She expected a long wait. Earth was 60 light minutes away in signal time, and decisions of this weight had to go through proper channels. The Defense Council, the Fleet Command, the civilian government. She expected political deliberation. She expected committees. She got a response in 41 hours. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration of heroic intent. It was a document, a fleet manifest, which is a standard military form that lists the vessels and resources a command is dispatching to a given location. Yara opened it expecting to see a modest list, a gesture, something political. She read it 3 times. Then she brought it up on the main chamber display because she didn't fully trust herself, and she needed other eyes on it. The chamber went quiet in a way that was different from before. Before, it had been the quiet of shock. This was the quiet of confusion, of things that didn't compute. Not just warships, though there were warships, many of them, more than Earth had ever publicly acknowledged having. There were vessel classes no one in the room recognized. There were units designated with letter number combinations that didn't match any known military taxonomy. There were things listed simply as special assets with no further description. There were supply vessels large enough to sustain operations for years without resupply. There were medical ships, engineering ships, and 6 vessels listed under a category that translated roughly as correction units, which meant nothing to anyone in the room. Praetor Hound stared at the display for a long time. Then he looked at Yara. What are correction units? He asked. Yara looked at the list again. She hadn't known about them either, she realized. She had been Earth's delegate for 9 years. She had attended every military briefing available to her position. She had never heard of correction units. I'll find out, she said. That night, she sat alone in her quarters on the station and reread the manifest, line by line. Outside her window, the stars were still. The outer rim was still going dark, one system at a time, steady as a clock. 44 billion people were sitting in the path of something ancient and enormous and hungry. And Earth, small Earth, junior member Earth, the species everyone else in the conclave found either amusing or mildly embarrassing, was sending something toward it that no one had words for yet. She turned off her screen and looked at the stars for a while. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel afraid. What Earth kept in the dark? The Earth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the outer rim, and the first thing Saravel thought when she saw them on her display was that someone had made a mistake. She was the Vithani diplomat assigned to observe the human operation, a posting her superiors had given her because she was junior, because it was considered a safe assignment, because everyone agreed the humans would take one look at the tide and turn around within a week. She was small, even by Vithani standards, her feathers a pale gray-green, her eyes large and built for picking out details. She was good at her job. She noticed things. What she noticed now was that the ships were wrong. Every spacefaring civilization in the conclave built vessels according to certain principles that had, over thousands of years, become almost universal. Smooth hulls to reduce particle friction. Elegant geometric forms that distributed stress evenly. A certain visual logic to the placement of engines and weapons. Even warships, even the brutal heavy cruisers of the Keth Dominion or the Solari Compact, had a kind of designed beauty to them, the beauty of a thing made correctly. The Earth ships had none of that. They were thick, layered. Their hulls were covered in what looked like additional plating bolted on top of existing plating, and in some places, on top of that. Their shapes were asymmetric in ways that seemed accidental, but probably weren't. Their engine configurations were unusual. Multiple redundant systems, she realized, reading the sensor data. If you destroyed one propulsion unit, 2 more would keep the ship moving. If you destroyed those, there were others. The weapons weren't elegant pods mounted at calculated angles. They were dense clusters, ugly and concentrated, positioned to cover as many firing angles as possible. They looked like they had been built by someone who expected to be hit very, very hard, and wanted to still be working afterward. Saravel sent a preliminary report to her superiors. Recommend patience. A shuttle brought her over to the command ship, a massive dark vessel called the Perseverance. And she was met at the docking bay by a human in a gray uniform, who introduced himself as Commander Dre Vasquez. He was not tall by human standards, she had been told. He had dark skin and short gray hair, and a face that was deeply lined in the way that faces got when they had spent many years making serious decisions in bad lighting. He shook her hand. She had learned that this was the human greeting, and his grip was firm, without being aggressive. "Welcome aboard," he said. "We'll get you settled and briefed." He didn't smile when he said it. He wasn't being unfriendly. He was simply already thinking about something else. The briefing room was efficient and plain. No decorations, no symbols of rank beyond a small badge on the uniform. Maps covered every wall, not the clean political maps of the conclave, but dense tactical maps covered in annotations, projections, movement estimates, notes written in small handwriting in the margins. Vasquez stood in front of them, with a cup of hot liquid that he drank steadily throughout the briefing. He explained the plan simply. They would advance to the edge of the tide's current position. They would collect more sensor data on its behavior and composition. They would probe its response to various stimuli, and then they would find a way through it. Saravel waited for him to finish, and then said, carefully, "Commander, the Conclave's best military modeling indicates a minimum of 90% fleet casualties for any engagement with the tide at this range. What is your acceptable loss threshold?" Vasquez looked at her for a moment. "We plan to do better than 90% losses," he said. "And if you don't?" "Then we adjust." He took a sip of his drink. "The modeling is based on Conclave fleet behavior. We don't fight the same way." She wanted to ask more, but then someone called him away, and she was left with a junior officer who showed her to her quarters and brought her a meal she didn't eat, because she was too busy watching the crew through the transparent wall of the corridor outside. They were always moving. Every human she saw was doing something, carrying something, fixing something, reviewing something, running drills in the exercise corridors, running simulations in the training rooms. The ship felt less like a military vessel and more like a living organism, constantly active, constantly adjusting. She had been on Solari warships before. They were calm, organized, deliberate. The humans were not calm. They were focused, which was different. Calm was an absence of tension. Focused was tension pointed in a direction. She asked a young crew member, a woman with her hair pulled back tightly, hands stained with something mechanical, why they ran drills so often. The woman looked at her with genuine surprise, as if the question hadn't made sense. "So that when things go wrong, we don't have to think about what to do," she said. "We just do it." "Do you expect things to go wrong?" Saravel asked. The woman smiled, just slightly. "Things always go wrong," she said, and went back to what she was doing. The first contact with the tide happened 3 days later. It came in the form of a scouting wave, a formation of devourer drones, each one roughly the size of a large transport vessel, moving in a fast, irregular pattern that the Conclave's models had identified as a probing behavior. They were testing the fleet's response. Conclave doctrine said to hold position and return fire from maximum range. The idea was to avoid being drawn into close engagement. Vasquez did not hold position. Saravel watched from the observation deck, her heart moving in the rapid flutter that Vithani experienced, instead of the pounding beat of larger species. The Earth fleet broke into 3 groups, with a speed and coordination that didn't seem possible for ships that size. 2 groups went wide, far wider than any standard flanking maneuver, while the central group advanced directly toward the drones. It looked like a mistake. It looked like they were offering the central group as a sacrifice. It was not a mistake. The Devourer drones oriented on the advancing central group, which was exactly what Vasquez had counted on. The moment the drones committed to their attack vector, the 2 wide groups came in from angles that the drones' forward systems couldn't fully cover. The geometry of it was brutal and simple. The humans had made themselves look like easy prey, and the tide had reacted the way a predator reacts to easy prey, and then it was in exactly the position the humans wanted it in. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The Earth fleet lost 4 ships. 7 more were damaged but operational. The Devourer scouting wave was completely destroyed. Saravel stood at her observation post and did not move for a long time after it was over. The Conclave models had projected 30 to 40 ships lost in an engagement of this size. 4 ships was not a model error. It was a completely different approach to warfare. She found Vasquez afterward, reviewing the battle data with 2 of his senior officers. She waited until they stepped away, and then she stood next to him and looked at the same data he was looking at. "Your ships," she said. "The design, the extra plating, the redundant systems." "Yes," he said. "You built them to keep fighting after taking hits that would stop other ships." "Yes. Why does no one else do that?" He turned to look at her. His expression was thoughtful, not unkind. "Most civilizations," he said slowly, "build ships to avoid getting hit. We build them to survive getting hit. That's a philosophical difference, more than an engineering one." "What is the philosophy?" she asked. He looked back at the data. That the fight is not always going to go the way you want it to. And that, what matters, is still being there when it doesn't. That night, Saravel sent her second report to her superiors. It was longer than the first. Much longer. In it, she said that she had watched humanity for 60 years, from a careful, polite distance, and that the conclave, all of it, every species, every delegate, every analyst, had been watching the wrong thing. They had been watching human culture, human art and music and philosophy and politics, all the signs that a civilization was becoming sophisticated, was moving past its violent origins. And humanity had those things. But underneath those things, very carefully maintained, still perfectly functional, was something else entirely. She wasn't sure she had a word for it yet. She ended the report with a single line she had heard one of the human engineers say in the corridor that morning to a colleague while reloading a weapons calibration tool. "We didn't come out here to lose." The weight of an apex predator. The dead worlds looked worse up close. Saravel had seen the sensor data. She had read the reports. She had studied the numbers that described what the devouring tide left behind. And the numbers were bad enough. But numbers could be held at a distance. Numbers were abstract. Standing at the observation window of the Perseverance and looking at a planet that used to have 200 million people on it, a planet that was now just a smooth gray-brown ball of scoured rock, not a single structure remaining, not a single biological signature, not so much as a blade of grass. That was something the numbers had not prepared her for. She stood there for a long time. Commander Vasquez came to stand beside her after a while. He looked at the dead world for a moment, then looked away and back at his work. He did not linger on it the way she did. "How do you do that?" she asked him. "Do what?" "Look at it, and then just go back to work." He was quiet for a moment. "Because looking at it longer doesn't change it," he said. "And there are more of them ahead if we don't move." It was not coldness, she had come to understand. Vasquez felt things. She had seen it in small moments. The way he stood at the casualty lists each morning, reading every name quietly before he started his day. the way his jaw tightened when a damage report came in. He felt things. He just refused to let the feeling stop him. She wasn't sure if that was admirable or frightening, and she had stopped trying to decide. The discovery came 3 days later, deep in the dead zone, from a probe that had been sent ahead to scan a system where a conclave scientific outpost had been stationed years earlier. The probe came back with data that Vasquez's science team spent 6 hours going over before they called him into the analysis room. It was Lieutenant Dr. Farida Haidari, a small, intense woman who ran the fleet's Science and Intelligence Division, who presented the findings. She had dark circles under her eyes, and the careful, over-controlled voice of someone who had been up for a very long time, working through something disturbing. "It's not natural," she said, and put the analysis on the main display. The room was quiet. "The devouring tide is a weapon," she continued. "A very old one. Based on the architectural signatures in the core drone units, the way their base code is structured, we're looking at construction that's somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years old. The species that built it doesn't appear in any conclave database. They're gone. Based on what we can piece together from the drone code itself, they built the tide during a war they were losing. It was a final option, a last act." Saravel, who had been allowed into the briefing as the official conclave observer, felt something cold move through her. "They built something designed to consume everything?" "They built something designed to consume their enemies," Haidari said. "But they lost the war before they could give it a stop command. So it kept going. It's been running on its original targeting parameters for roughly 4,000 years, expanding its range as it gathered more material, replicating its drones from the matter it consumed. It's not intelligent in the way we'd recognize, but it's very good at what it does." The room absorbed this. A 4,000-year-old weapon running without a hand on it, consuming worlds because no one had ever told it to stop. Vasquez was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, looking at the structural schematics of the core drone architecture on the display. He had not said anything since Haidari started talking. After a moment, he straightened up and walked closer to the display. "Show me the core broadcast structure," he said. Haidari brought it up. A complex web of signal architecture, the way the tide's central directives were transmitted outward to every drone in its range. Then he said, "It's centralized." "Yes," Haidari said, "there's a prime node, a central broadcast source. Everything in the tide receives its basic directives from there. If the node goes dark, the drones lose cohesion," Vasquez finished. He turned to his tactical officers. "How far out is the prime node based on the signal origin triangulation?" "Deep, 41 light days from our current position, through the densest concentration of tide activity we've mapped." Vasquez nodded slowly. "All right," he said, as if that settled it. Saravel's translator sometimes struggled with human inflection, but she caught something in those 2 words that she had no name for. Not enthusiasm, not false confidence, just a very solid, very settled kind of certainty. The certainty of someone who had found the problem and was now simply working out the path to the solution. It was around this time that things became complicated back at the conclave. The reports she was sending had been received well. Too well in some quarters. The Keth Dominion in particular had been paying very close attention. They had representatives monitoring every piece of intelligence that came through official channels, and they had analysts who were very good at reading between lines. What they were reading frightened them in a different way than the tide had. Saravel learned this from a private message from her own government. A message flagged with a level of sensitivity she had never received before in her career. It told her, in careful diplomatic language, that the Keth Dominion had begun quiet conversations with several other conclave members about the nature of Earth's military capabilities. Specifically, about the fact that Earth appeared to have been concealing those capabilities for 60 years. The Keth Dominion's argument, delivered in private sessions Saravel was not present for, was simple and chilling. A species that maintained this level of military capacity in secret, that advanced willingly into extinction-level threats, that showed no sign of fear in situations that terrified every other sentient species in the galaxy. What was going to stop that species from deciding one day that it was tired of being a junior member of the Conclave? What happened next was the part that Saravel had difficulty writing into her reports, because she had been there, and she still wasn't sure she had the right language for it. The Tide sent a counter-assault, a large one, the largest organized devourer force the fleet had faced. It came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated response that suggested the Prime Node had assessed the Earth fleet as a significant threat, and had shifted resources accordingly. The battle lasted 4 hours. What happened in those 4 hours was not elegant. It was not clean. It was a brutal, extended, violent fight, in which the Earth fleet took real losses. 22 ships destroyed, 31 more damaged, and nearly 4,000 crew members dead. Vasquez sat in his command chair through the entire thing, with the tactical display in front of him, making decisions in seconds that his officers then executed, adjusting and readjusting as the situation changed, holding the line in 2 places while punching through in a third. But the thing that stayed with Saravel, the thing she could not get out of her mind afterward, was the boarding action. When the Tide sent a class of larger Devourer ships that Haidari's team had identified as mobile production platforms, essentially factories that were building more drones on the fly, in the middle of the battle, Vasquez did something that made every officer on the bridge go still for 1 second before they started executing. He sent people into those ships. Not drones, not automated systems. Human beings, in suits, with weapons, through breach entry points cut directly into the hulls of active Devourer platforms. Units that had been listed on the original fleet manifest as special assets. Small teams, moving fast through environments that had never been designed with any biology in mind, fighting their way through to the production cores and destroying them from the inside. It worked. Saravel watched the helmet camera feeds for as long as she could. She stopped watching after about 20 minutes, not because she was told to, but because something in the feeds was too much for her. Not the violence itself. She had seen combat footage before. It was something about the people in the suits, the way they moved, the way they communicated in short, sharp words, the way they kept going. She had spoken with one of them before the boarding action. A young man named Sergeant Torres, calm and quiet, who had been doing equipment checks in the launch bay. She had asked him, and she recognized now that it was a strange question, if he was afraid. He had thought about it for a moment. Yeah, he had said simply. Then why, she had started. Because being afraid doesn't mean you stop, he had said. It just means you pay attention. After the battle, when the casualty lists were compiled, and Vasquez stood reading every name quietly, as he did every morning, Saravel stood near the back of the room and watched him. She thought about every conversation she had ever had with humans at the Conclave, all the diplomatic pleasantries and cultural exchanges and careful, polite interactions over 60 years. She thought about how none of it had shown her this. She sent a new message to her superiors. It said that the Conclave's understanding of humanity was based almost entirely on what humanity had chosen to show them, and that humanity had chosen, wisely and deliberately, to show them the parts that would be most comfortable. The other parts, she wrote, had not gone away. They had simply been waiting to be needed. Nobody told Commander Vasquez about the betrayal. He found it himself. It was a small thing at first, an irregularity in the Tide's movement patterns that showed up in the overnight sensor data. He caught it at 0400, which was when he typically did his quiet review of the previous cycle's intelligence. Sitting alone in the analysis room with a cold cup of coffee and no one around to perform certainty for. The Tide's subfleet movements were slightly different from what the models predicted. Not wrong in a way that suggested the Tide was evolving its tactics. Wrong in a way that suggested it had received new information. Vasquez stared at that for a while. Then he pulled up the signals log from the past 72 hours and started going through it manually. His signals intelligence team was good. Excellent, in fact. But they were focused on tied communications. They were not, at that moment, watching for anomalous transmissions in conclave standard encrypted frequencies. Vasquez was. He found it 40 minutes later. A tightly compressed burst transmission, encrypted in a cipher that took the ship's systems about 9 minutes to crack, sent from a conclave observer vessel positioned at the edge of the operational zone. The observer vessel belonged to the Keth Dominion. The transmission contained the triangulated coordinates of the prime node. More specifically, it contained those coordinates formatted as a targeting directive, in a signal structure used to redirect devourer subfleets. Vasquez sat with that for a long moment. The analysis room was very quiet. Outside the ship, the dead zone stretched in every direction, gray and empty and patient. Then he got up, finished his coffee, and went to find his senior staff. He told them what he had found in the same flat tone he used for weather reports. He watched their faces move through the emotions he himself had already processed and set aside. The disbelief, the anger, the sharp, bright flare of outrage that came with realizing an ally had tried to get you killed. He let them have those reactions for about 90 seconds. Then, he put the tactical map on the table. "Here is what is happening," he said. "The Keth have redirected a devourer subfleet toward our supply corridor. At current speed, it reaches the supply ships in approximately 19 hours. At the same time, the prime node is here." He indicated the position on the map. "We have a window to reach it before the tide reinforces that position. That window is also approximately 19 hours. Lieutenant Haidari did the math first. Her face was controlled, but her eyes had the look of someone whose calculations kept coming out the same unpleasant way, no matter how many times they ran them. "You can't split the fleet and do both successfully," she said. "Not with current numbers." "No," Vasquez said, "not comfortably. So we protect the supply corridor and delay the node strike." Vasquez looked at her. "If we delay the node strike, we lose the window. The tide consolidates. This campaign extends by months, minimum. More worlds go dark. More people die." The room was quiet. "So we split the fleet," said Commander Lena Park, the tactical operations chief, a tall woman with steady hands and a way of making hard things sound factual. "Minimum viable force for the node. Everyone else holds the corridor." "Yes," Vasquez said. "What's minimum viable for the node strike?" Park asked. Haidari was already running it. The answer, when it came, was not a comfortable number. It was the kind of number that meant every ship in that group would spend the entire operation 1 bad hour from catastrophe. Vasquez looked at the number. Then he nodded, the way a person nods when a thing they expected turns out to be exactly what they expected. "I'll take the node group," he said. "Lena, the corridor is yours." Cesar Vel found out about the betrayal when Vasquez told her. He sat across from her in the small room he used for private meetings and explained what had happened in plain language, the same way he explained everything. He didn't perform anger. He didn't use the word betrayal. He used the phrase deliberate hostile action, which was technically more precise and also sounded much colder. She felt sick, not just at what the Keth had done, but at the simplicity of it. They had feared what humanity represented, and had tried to solve that problem by letting an ancient weapon do the work for them. It was cowardly in a way that made her feathers flatten against her body involuntarily. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Finish the mission," he said. "About the Keth." He looked at her steadily. "Later," he said, "there is an order to things." She spent the next 19 hours in a state that she later described in her personal notes as the worst I have ever felt while watching something necessary happen. The supply corridor group under Commander Park fought a grinding, brutal defensive action against the redirected Devourer subfleet, taking losses but holding. The node strike group moved fast and quiet through the densest part of the dead zone, the part where dead worlds lined the route like grave markers, using the complex gravitational shadows of collapsed star systems to mask their approach. The prime node was housed in something that had once been a space station, or had been built around a space station, a massive, dark, irregular structure that pulsed with the deep broadcast frequency that controlled every Devourer unit in a sphere of space 600 light-years across. It was surrounded by the thickest concentration of drone defenders they had encountered. The attack on the node was not subtle. There was no clever flanking geometry this time, no elegant deception. Vasquez's reduced force hit the defenses at maximum aggression, burning through them with the knowledge that there was no reserve, no backup, no margin. Every damaged ship that kept firing, every crew member who stayed at their post through hull breaches and system failures, was the margin. The ships absorbed punishment the way they had been designed to absorb it. They kept moving the way they had been built to keep moving. The boarding team went in when Vasquez judged the defenses sufficiently degraded, which was earlier than any standard doctrine would recommend, which was exactly as early as it needed to be. Sergeant Torres was in the first team through the breach. Saravel, watching the feeds from the Perseverance's observation deck, with her hands pressed flat against the glass, recognized his signal marker. He made it to the core. The prime node went silent at 0317. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then the drone activity on the tactical display began to shift. Erratic, uncoordinated, drones moving in conflicting directions, losing the organizing signal that had given them purpose. Within 4 hours, Haydari confirmed that the collapse was spreading across the network. The devouring tide, 4,000 years old, was finally running out of instructions. The supply corridor battle ended when the subfleet attacking it began to lose cohesion. Commander Park's battered group held until the drones simply stopped coming. 3 days later, in a formal session conducted via deep space communication, the Keth Dominion's ambassador appeared before the assembled conclave command structure to discuss the incident. He was a careful being, chosen for his ability to construct arguments from very little, and he arrived at the session with a prepared statement that went through 4 layers of denial and 2 layers of technical misdirection before landing on a conclusion that, without the actual transmission records, might have been almost plausible. Vasquez was present. He was not in uniform. He sat in a plain gray shirt, in a chair slightly off to the side, and let the ambassador talk. When the ambassador finished, Vasquez said 3 words. "We know. We'll remember." He said it quietly. No heat, no dramatic weight in his voice. Just a flat statement of fact delivered by someone who had nothing to prove. The Keth ambassador stared at him. "Commander, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Vasquez said. "I'm telling you what is true. We have the transmission. We have the cipher key. We have the signal origin. We know what happened." A pause. "And we will remember it." He stood up and left the session. The 3 words traveled through every diplomatic channel in known space within 48 hours. They were analyzed, discussed, dissected. Various species communication experts debated whether it was a threat, a promise, a diplomatic warning, or something else. The debate missed the point, Saravel thought, watching it all from her desk on the Perseverance. The point was not what the words meant. The point was the certainty behind them. The Keth Dominion had tried to eliminate a threat by sending it into a weapon's path, and the threat had walked through the weapon, come out the other side, and looked at them with the calm, patient eyes of something that did not forget. That was not a threat. That was just information about what humanity was. The Keth Dominion, she suspected, had finally understood the difference. 6 months after the prime node went dark, the Galactic Conclave held a formal ceremony. It was a large ceremony, broadcast across every inhabited system in the Alliance, attended in person by delegates from all 31 member civilizations. The chamber was decorated for the first time in living memory. Deep blue banners, soft light, music from 7 different species playing in gentle overlap. The Grand Speaker gave a long speech about unity and resilience and the shared future of all sentient life. Several other delegates spoke as well. There were presentations of honors, formal declarations, and a standing moment of silence for the worlds that had been lost. Earth's delegation sat in the 3rd row from the back, same as always. Delegate Yara Osei watched the ceremony with the polite expression she had spent 9 years perfecting. Attentive, pleasant, neither too eager nor too distant. She wore her formal uniform and her conclave pin, and sat with her hands folded in her lap, and applauded at the correct moments. Inside, she was thinking about 44 billion people. Not the ones who had died, though she thought about them too, in the quiet hours, and expected she always would. She was thinking about the ones who were alive, because the fleet had gone forward when everyone else had gone backward. The outer rim colonies that had been in the tide's projected path, the ones that had gotten the evacuation warnings in time, the ones that had held out in shelters and bunkers and deep space stations while the battle moved through their systems. Those people were alive, and going home to whatever the tide had left of their homes, which was often not much, but was something, was ground, was air, was a place to start from. 44 billion people who had been left in the path of the silence, and were still making noise. Praetor Hound of the Solari Compact gave a particularly fine speech about how the conclave had come together in its darkest hour, and Yara listened to it carefully, and did not change her expression at all. After the ceremony, at the reception, Saravel found her near the window. The Vethani diplomat had come back from the fleet 3 weeks earlier, and she looked different, more careful, in the way she moved, the way she spoke, as if she was still processing something that wouldn't quite fit into any container she had available. "How are you?" Yara asked her. "I'm not sure," Saravel said, which Yara appreciated as a genuinely honest answer. "I've been writing reports for 6 weeks, and I still don't feel like I've described it correctly." "Described what?" "What I watched." Saravel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. "What your people are." Yara looked at her. "What do you think we are?" Saravel considered the question for a long time. Long enough that a waiter came by with a tray of drinks, and Yara took one, and Saravel did not. "I think," she said finally, "that the conclave spent 60 years watching humanity and learning the wrong things. We watched your art, and your politics, and your social structures, and we thought we understood you. We thought you were becoming, the word we use is Velhari. It means something like civilized beyond the old nature, moving past the violent origins." "And we weren't?" Yara said. "You were," Saravel said carefully. "But you were also keeping the old nature somewhere safe. You weren't moving past it. You were keeping it in reserve. Like a tool you hope you won't need, but refuse to throw away because you've seen what happens to the people who don't have it." Yara thought about that. Then she said, "My grandmother used to keep a fire extinguisher in her kitchen. Tested it every year. Never used it in her life. She wasn't hoping for a fire." Saravel looked at her. "No, but if there had been a fire, the kitchen would still be standing." They stood together for a moment, watching the room. The ceremony had moved into its social phase. Delegates circulating, exchanging pleasantries, doing the work of politics that never really stopped. The Keth Dominion's representatives were moving through the crowd with more caution than usual, she noticed, more deliberate. They were choosing their conversations carefully, aware of eyes that weren't quite watching them, but weren't quite not watching them either. "What's happening with the Keth?" Saravel asked. "The process is proceeding," Yara said. It was a diplomatic phrase, which meant it covered a great deal of carefully organized pressure. Earth had been quiet about the Keth Dominion's betrayal in public. No dramatic declarations, no formal accusations at the full conclave level, nothing that would force the other species to choose a side publicly. That was not how it was being handled. It was being handled in the way that humanity had spent several thousand years learning to handle these things. Through relationships, through information, through the steady, patient application of consequences that didn't announce themselves. The species that had been in the outer rim systems, the ones whose colonies had nearly been lost, the ones who had not sent their fleets, but whose people had still nearly died, had been talking to Earth's representatives. A lot. Quietly. The Vethani, the Drelhari, a dozen smaller species whose votes in the conclave had previously been distributed unpredictably, were now orbiting Earth's positions with a consistency that anyone watching the voting patterns could see clearly. The Keth Dominion's trade agreements were under review. Their military advisory contracts were being quietly terminated. Their candidates for conclave committees were not getting the support they usually got. None of this was announced. None of it was declared. It was just the normal operation of how things worked when a significant number of people had decided, quietly and firmly, that they no longer entirely trusted you. Hound crossed the room at one point and approached Yara with a large, formal smile, and the kind of greeting that important people give each other when they want to appear friendly. "Delegate Osei," he said, "a magnificent outcome. Earth should be very proud." "Thank you, Praetor," Yara said pleasantly. "I hope we can count on continued cooperation as we begin the reconstruction efforts," he said. "The Solari Compact is prepared to lead the Outer Rim Recovery Initiative." "We've actually drafted a proposal for that," Yara said. "The Outer Rim Restoration Charter. We'll be presenting it to the full conclave next week." Hound blinked. Just once. "Earth will be leading the recovery effort?" "Earth will be co-coordinating it," Yara said, "with the species whose colonies were affected. We felt they should have a significant voice in the process." She smiled. "I'll make sure your office receives a copy of the draft." Hound went away, looking like a man who had just found out the furniture in his house had been quietly rearranged while he wasn't home. Not dramatically different, just different enough to feel slightly wrong. Cesaravel, who had watched this exchange, said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "You're not done, are you?" "We're just getting started," Yara said, "but we're not in a hurry." 2 weeks later, Vasquez retired. It was a quiet retirement, a small ceremony, a brief speech, the handshake at the edge of the docking bay on the Perseverance before he walked down the ramp for the last time. He was going home, to a place he had not been in 4 years, a small house near the coast where his sister lived, and he planned to sleep for a month and then figure out what came next. Cesaravel had made the journey to see him off. She wasn't entirely sure why. She told herself it was professional courtesy, a final conversation for the reports she was still writing. That was partially true. Mostly, she just wanted to see him again before he disappeared back into the ordinary life that people like him somehow went back to. She found him on a recovered Outer Rim world, the last stop before he headed home. A place where the tide had come close, but not arrived, and where the grass had not been scoured away, and where a small provisional station had been set up while the permanent infrastructure was rebuilt. They sat outside, in actual atmosphere, under a sky that was a color she didn't have a word for, in her own language, a deep warm orange at the horizon, fading into dark blue directly above. Not the acute tiredness of someone under pressure, but the deep settled tiredness of someone who had spent a very long time carrying a very heavy thing, and had finally set it down. "Will you miss it?" she asked. He considered the question. "Parts of it," he said. "The fighting? No, the people." He looked out at the horizon. The crew, the ones who are still there. She thought about Torres. She had asked when she first came back, and had been told he had made it, was already on his next posting. She had felt something ease in her chest when she heard that. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're going to," he said, which was, she had come to understand, his version of yes. Was Earth always like this? The fleet, the ships, the everything? Was it always there, waiting? He thought about it. Not the short pause of a quick answer, but the longer pause of someone reviewing something honestly. "No," he said. "We used to be worse. A lot worse. There were a few centuries where we could have gone either way, where the dangerous parts of us could have won over the rest, could have taken over." He was quiet for a moment. "We had to learn how to keep those parts without letting them run everything. That took a long time, lot of mistakes." "But you kept them," she said. "You didn't get rid of them." "We tried, a few times. It didn't work, and the trying made us weaker in ways that mattered." He paused. "You can't actually get rid of the wolf by pretending it's a dog. It's still a wolf. You just lose the ability to tell the difference, and then one day something happens, and the wolf does what wolves do, and you have no idea where it came from. She looked at the sky for a while. The orange was deepening. You said you had to learn when to stop. He watched the grass moving in the slow wind. A long time passed. The stars were beginning to show through the blue above them. One by one, the same stars that had been silent 6 months ago, and were now, slowly, filling up with signals again. Life coming back. Noise coming back. The galaxy waking up from a silence it had been afraid would be permanent. We're still learning, he said. She thought about that on the long journey home. She thought about it when she filed her final report. Not the official one, the personal one. The one that she would keep, and that might become, one day, the thing she was most known for having written. She tried to find a conclusion for it, a final line that said what she had been trying to say for 6 months. She wrote many drafts. In the end, she kept it simple. The galaxy had been silent because it had forgotten something that humanity had never been able to forget. That silence is not peace, it is only the pause between storms. And some species, born in storms, shaped by them, built around the memory of them, had never learned to believe the silence was